In the winter of 2020, on the eve of 2021, ninth grade students in the Holyoke Public Schools Ethnic Studies program, along with their teachers, had this idea to create a video. The purpose of this video would be to place the Holyoke Ethnic Studies program into the larger national movement and conversation for bringing ethnic studies into our schools. And so we made this video as a collaborative effort between students, teachers, alumni, program partners, and myself, Dana Altshuler, the HPS Ethnic Studies Director. Our students worked with teachers to generate interview questions and to identify folks from our ethnic studies community to interview for this video. And we tapped into the talents of community partner Iohann Rashi Vega to actualize this idea into a video text that you are now invited to engage with. This short video will explore why does ethnic studies matter broadly and in Holyoke? What are the benefits of ethnic studies as experienced by teachers, former students, and community and national partners? And what can we learn from the larger movement towards ethnic studies as we continue to build our own program here in Holyoke? One of the questions we asked our interviewees was, what is ethnic studies? I just want to take a moment on this platform to share with you what ethnic studies means to me. I was introduced to ethnic studies in 2009 when I was a history teacher in San Francisco, California. For me, ethnic studies has been the humanizing response or clap back to the dehumanizing system of public education. And I cannot imagine the educator or human I would be without ethnic studies as my North Star. I will tell you that ethnic studies has helped me to read the world by giving me language to identify injustices and also privilege that I have experienced in my own life. Through ethnic studies, we dig deep into root causes like racism and colonialism because to create another world, we must understand the ills of our current world. You and I inherited an unjust world. As ethnic studies scholars, we are committed to dismantling systems rooted in racism and colonialism, and so we must spend time exercising the imaginative and creative parts of our brain muscles to really imagine the world we want and deserve to live in. For me, that means a world where the markers of a person's identity does not determine their access to basic human rights such as healthcare, housing, food security, and liberatory education. As ethnic studies scholars living in challenging and complex times, we must be both creative and have hope. My hope comes from the activist scholars and freedom dreamers of past and present, like Frederick Douglass, who got free from slavery and spent his life working in collaboration with others to dismantle and abolish that impossible system. And Pedro Albizu Campos, who fought for the liberation of Puerto Rico and helped Ireland get free from the colonial rule of England. Both are examples of when we fight, we win. And in time, the world can become the world we deserve to live in. And so, ethnic studies is hope. It is love. It is honing and growing our criticality to read, understand, and transform.
Hi, my name is Selena Garcia. I took ethnic studies and HPS from 8th grade to 12th grade, and I also was in HPS from kindergarten to 12th grade. So I went through the whole system. I was kind of like a guinea pig for the ethnic studies class. So that's why my experiences is probably very different from like the people in the classes now. And now I'm at Smith College, which is like 20 minutes away, and I'm an undecided major, but it's definitely going to be related to like race and ethnicity. What is ethnic studies? To me, ethnic studies is the study of historically marginalized groups of people. In like simple terms, the study of the other, because that's what we have been defined as for a long time. And we acknowledge differences in people and the power and intersectionality.
My name is Zaiell Vargas. I am currently a Mount Holyoke student. I am a Holyoke High School alum. I took ethnic studies for 4 years. And what ethnic studies is to me is, like Selena said, the study of marginalized groups of people, but more specifically, it shifts the classroom thinking from a more Eurocentric perspective to a more broader range perspective of other identities, other cultures, all these things that we got to learn about that were not from the Eurocentric perspective.
Okay, so to describe a joyful or meaningful learning experience from one of my ethnic studies classrooms, a joyful learning experience for me was planning the ethnic studies pop out or the block party. I think it was really interesting to work with college students who like are learning the same thing that kind of we were learning in the classroom at the same time. It was kind of weird. Like, I guess we're getting this for free and like they're not. So that was interesting. Also, how we can learn from each other. So like what they were learning in their classes, they could teach to us, and what we were learning, we could teach to them. I was in the invitation committee. Well, low-key wasn't fun, but like it was still interesting to like, because you can still like collaborate with the other groups in the class that were planning the block party. Um, at least it was a valuable experience seeing the people and the parents that came to like acknowledge ethnic studies and like who actually wanted to see what their children were learning in schools. That was really fun. And it was also interesting to see how not like easy it is, but like it was kind of easy to get money to like have that going on. So like there's people out there who support ethnic studies and like I really appreciated that. It was pretty clever to me, honestly. Like the name just came out of nowhere. We were like, oh, let's call it the Expo and like let's get people going and let's get food and drinks and like it was just a fun collaboration, honestly. That's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, for me, one of my most like joyful or meaningful classroom experiences, it's so hard to pick, but I would have to say like all the times like people would tell me, well, this is just one thing in specific, but I'll go further. All the times people would tell me like, wow, I love that you're learning this now. Like I had to pay for that in college. So it's just like Selena said, the fact that we got a lot of these experiences for free was just mind boggling. But one time in specific was when we all went into the community and we went to the different community organizations and we were all just like their community building together as a class, but also, you know, helping out at the same time. I had a really powerful conversation at Nueva Esperanza. We were just learning about the services that they have there, and we were creating like, you know, what a dream Holyoke would look like. And we were like discussing like all of the injustices, like with the parades and stuff that happened throughout the year. And I just really enjoyed that experience. It was really powerful for me.
Okay, so how does ethnic studies classroom feel different from a normal classroom? Ethnic studies, we do our best to step away from a Eurocentric curriculum. Essentially, everything in the U.S. is built like on white supremacy, and honestly, that cannot be reformed. So, like, as we can only do so much, honestly, right? Like, we have power within our limits, basically. So, ethnic studies kind of helps bring students' lives into the classroom because I feel like when you're in a normal quote unquote classroom, teachers expect you to just throw away like everything that just happened. Like yesterday, maybe I don't know, a lot of things do happen. Like people think it's very extreme, but like maybe someone in your family, like maybe they overdosed, maybe like you just became homeless. Like we don't know what's going on in other children's lives, and they teachers just expect you to forget about those things and come to class the next day like nothing happened. And like that's honestly not reasonable at all. And I feel like ethnic studies was a place for you to like not let those things behind and bring them with you. And like teachers will help you out and your peers will help you out and everyone sees you out. Like it's not perfect, but there's plenty of areas where like essentially ethnic studies is like kind of like a safe place for a lot of people. Like those classrooms, like even the decoration in these classrooms is helpful for some people while they're doing their work, or even just like seeing those teachers that actually value students is something very helpful for students as well.
For me, an ethnic studies class always differed from a regular class because of how I felt when I walked in the room. I always felt very welcomed. I always felt like it was very bright. It was the space that I wanted to be in versus a space that I had to be in. Um, an ethnic studies classroom was just a haven. Just being able to see all of the colorful pictures on the wall, just having a very vibrant energy in the room. I knew it was something like I was excited to learn about. So I would always be so excited going to my ethnic studies classrooms. And it felt different because it was more of a community as opposed to a school environment. All of my other classrooms were highly segregated and it wasn't even intentional. That was just the way the students sat. And so in an ethnic studies classroom, we just sat wherever we pleased. We would all like, we didn't care. We would all just like sit wherever we wanted. And it was just, I don't know, the only word I could use to describe it would be a community.
Why do we need ethnic studies in Holyoke? Honestly, in my opinion, it's self-explanatory. Like Holyoke is predominantly Latinx, and like when you go into most of the classrooms, you don't hear anything about Latinx people, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Colombian. Like it doesn't matter. Like you literally don't hear basically anything about people who look like us. I can recall like all of middle school, and it wasn't until eighth grade that I actually learned something about Puerto Rican people coming from a Puerto Rican household. Like to me, that doesn't make any sense. Like children should be learning from like, even from like 4 years old about themselves, because that is really a powerful experience. And it would just help like students have so many less traumatic experiences in classrooms and in schools. Also, like we need a space where we don't have to code switch all the time, because when we step out to society, we have to like switch our demeanor and like everything about ourselves just so we can like kind of advance and like finally work towards something that honestly like the system doesn't want us to work towards. And it's like tiring to have to filter out your life, especially in the classroom, like just walking and acting like, oh, yesterday, like kind of like how after the election, a lot of teachers won't talk about what just happened. Like when Trump was elected, I did not hear one teacher in high school speak about it at all. Even now while I'm in college, a lot of my professors just acted like the election wasn't happening. And I was like, hello, like, how can you neglect what happened the last 4 years and what's going to happen in the next 4 years? Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Also, like how a lot of teachers won't acknowledge, like, especially during high school, there was a lot of killings of Black people. I never heard that mentioned once by any of the teachers I had. And like, it's honestly, it's just disappointing to have like those kind of quote unquote normal classrooms where we don't talk about it, but ethnic studies was the only place that we talked about those issues.
So for me, we need ethnic studies in Holyoke in order to limit a lot of ignorances that are ongoing in our city. And by ignorance, I mean not only by like white people in dominant culture, but I do mean within the Latinx community as well, because there are like, and it's not at the faults of the Latinx community, it's the faults of the school systems. A lot of our Latinx community is, well, used to be like, you know, sometime before ethnic studies was predominantly like ignorant, I guess, or just discriminatory towards other Latinx people and just like continue that interpersonal oppression. But I feel like in order to limit or just diminish those ignorances overall, Latinx people need to be educated on their culture, on Latinx history, because they don't see enough of their own representation in the classrooms. And I feel like that is what's going to help Latinx communities in particular to understand that there's more to life than what our school systems is pushing them to be. You know what I mean? Like if ethnic studies is not in Holyoke schools, then it will just continuously perpetuate the school to prison pipeline. And I feel like that stands true. Like ethnic studies is not a barrier, but like it helps to prevent the school to prison pipeline, because it allows students to not only understand the injustices that's going on, but it also allows them to see a future that is outside, that is beyond them, that is greater for them. So that's why I feel like we need ethnic studies.
I also, wait, I have something. Okay. I think also it's not like because this is going in the video, it's not a us versus them conversation. It's okay like to be intersectional. Like it's okay to be Latinx and be white. It's okay to be Latinx and like you're Black. You can be anything. You can be Asian. It doesn't matter basically about your race. It just matters what you do with what you have. So like if you're white and Latinx, you have that privilege to like kind of like if you're white and Latinx, you have white privilege, and like you can use that to benefit your other Latinx people who are brown, Black, Native American, Indigenous. It doesn't matter. Like it's kind of all about what we learn and what we do with that, honestly. Like it isn't like, I know a lot of times when we speak to school officials and stuff, they'd be like, oh, white people, this and that. Like you guys talk about white people. Like, no, that's not literally it. Like I'm not trying to focus on white people. I'm trying to focus on myself and how white people are the ones that need to like kind of help me, because it's their problem. Like they're the one that created it in the first place, I guess. So like, essentially that's it. How has ethnic studies helped me after graduation? Ethnic studies has helped me because I feel kind of smart in college, actually, because I mean, I go to Smith, and like that's mostly like a liberal school, and like I guess a lot of folks already know a lot of the stuff that I know too, which is kind of interesting to see, because like in like high school that wasn't the case. But I guess it's interesting to see how other people learned what they learned and how I learned what I did. So like ethnic studies was not something in other people's schools. Like they had to like go out and learn on their own, or like they had like a kind of an awakening and they were like, oh, like I need to be like a better person. But I guess it was interesting to see that we learned this in the school, which is like very different, obviously, because you know we kind of get like resources and access to things that other people don't have access to. But it also helped me figure out like how to think critically and like analyze things from multiple perspectives and basically like criticize everything that should be criticized, which is everything. And And it also has given me a lot of connections. So like staying at Smith was a blessing because I am still nearby. And like, if I imagine I wanted an internship or something, or like, I don't know, anything. I could just be like, oh, like, Dana, do you know someone that can like help me do this? Or like, I know a lot of these people from Teach Western Mass, or like, I know a lot of educators in Western Mass area, or even like in Boston. And I think it's very helpful with getting connections, especially in the field that I want to go into.
Yeah, for me, ethnic studies has definitely helped me after graduation because one, I feel like it helped me like figure out where I want to go in terms of like my major. Right now I'm like focusing on sociology and political science, but I think I want to like extend that knowledge to like anthropology. Um, but in terms of like how I interact in the classroom, I feel like I was definitely more advanced than some of my other classmates, I guess, because like I took a 200 level Latinx studies course and I was the only freshman in there. And everybody was just amazed that I was a freshman because of how well I could speak and how well I like about the subjects that we were learning and how much I already knew. And that didn't surprise me because I was prepared for it, but I was just glad that coming into these classes, I had the knowledge that I already knew. I had the language that I needed. And all of these things just prepared me for college. Whereas, you know, when I was in high school, there were college students telling me, oh, wow, like I learned that in college. Like, you're so lucky, you know what I mean? And I guess ethnic studies has helped me to have like real world conversations. Like, even with my family, just like, especially after graduation, like all of the things that happened, all of the killings of like innocent Black people, like it just helped me to have those conversations with some of the people that I care about, and it helped me like be confident in what it was that I needed to say.
Okay, what would a world look like that valued and followed the aspects of ethnic studies? In my opinion, I think there would be more teachers of color and teachers that are experienced in teaching ethnic studies. Because like, of course, I guess anyone can kind of learn ethnic studies or do it, but you know, you have to have that foundation, honestly. Like you need to have had academia or academic experience in it. Although sometimes it doesn't, like you don't need that. Like sometimes you are the experience. Like a lot of people would be like, oh, you need to like read theory, a lot of this and that. It's like the theory is based on my experiences. So like, why should I have to like go read some like expensive book? But you know what I mean? Like you need to have some certification in that area. But I believe society that was that way kind of, we need to be culturally sensitive and culturally aware. Like it's not even about like certain things, I guess. Like it's as simple as like kind of like we shouldn't be individualistic. We should care about our neighbor. And like especially now with COVID, like when you go outside into the world today, like you need to be aware that there are people dying, and like whatever you do can affect other people. Like if you wear your mask, okay, but like make sure you're staying 6 feet away. If you're gonna go outside and like do things that you probably shouldn't be doing in a pandemic, make sure you're getting tested. Like it shouldn't be like we're only caring about ourselves. There are also other people that we should care about. And I guess that's kind of the value of ethnic studies. Like you're an individual in society, but also what you do affects other people. And I believe that that is something important.
For me, a world that followed and upheld the values of ethnic studies would definitely be different, but I guess I'll start within a school at first. Students, I feel like, would definitely want to go to school. They'll, you know, want to be learning because they see themselves, like more students are seeing themselves represented, and, you know, more other students are like understanding like different perspectives instead of one Eurocentric perspective. But I like how Selena put it, like, you know, the world would be less individualistic, more like community based, or just like entirely focused. And I really like that idea because she's right. Like ethnic studies upholds the values of just everybody who's not, in terms of like, who's not like Eurocentric, I guess, who are not from the Eurocentric perspective, even though like it's still incorporated in there. But I feel like in terms of the world, like if we had a world that did uphold these ethnic studies values and follow the values, our world would be more community based, and our world would be a little bit more empathetic towards people, like understanding that, you know, the world doesn't revolve around one certain group of people. The world is, you know, so diverse. There's so many things that, you know, go on in the world. And especially through ethnic studies, I just feel like the world would be way more empathetic than it is now.
My name is Simbrit Paskins. I currently teach Ethnic Studies ELA at Holyoke High School North Campus. Ethnic Studies is a type of education that makes you feel free. And when I say you, it could be you as a student of color, it could be you as a student who grew up in poverty or who grew up with immigrant parents. Ethnic Studies helps us understand truths about our country and racism and oppression and power, which are often conversations that are rarely had, especially at a young person's age. And so for me, it's been something that has helped me to find my voice and to speak up against things that are wrong. And yeah, that's what I got. That's what I know about ethnic studies. What brought me to ethnic studies, I discovered ethnic studies when I was in college. I went to Westfield State University and I had a lot of good experiences there, and I had a lot of challenging experiences there, as it was and still is, I think, a predominantly white institution. And so when I got to Westfield State, there was about 17% students of color on the campus, and I was one of them. And my freshman year, so my first year in college, I experienced a lot of racism, right? And a lot of prejudice, both inside the classroom and my learning experiences, and then outside of the classroom and social networks when like young college students are supposed to be just having fun. Myself and my friends found ourselves in different situations where racism was just like smacking us in the face left and right. And so towards the end of my freshman year, I was planning to drop out of school, and I happened to run into an ethnic studies professor, and that professor invited me into a class, and she told me there were no rules. I didn't have to sign up for the class. I could just come across campus and sit down in the classroom. And in that classroom, I learned that Christopher Columbus didn't discover America. I was 17 years old, which is something that everyone should know, and we should know the stories behind it. And so I was intrigued by that, and I stayed for the rest of my 4 years. So I was able to graduate with an ethnic studies degree. And now I'm able to teach it to high schoolers who are getting this information, things like Christopher Columbus, way before the age of 17. And so, yeah, I'd say that's what brought me to ethnic studies. How is ethnic studies different how is ethnic studies curriculum different from a traditional curriculum? I would say it's completely different for students and for teachers, right? So ethnic studies curriculum is centered on students. It's centered on you and your identity and where you come from, the things that have made your lives easy and the things that have made it hard. And as your ethnic studies teachers, we take all of that information and we use it to inform not only the topics that you learn about in class, but we use it to inform the way that we teach you and the way that we learn with you. And so in an ethnic studies classroom, you'll often hear or you'll often see or experience that the teacher is just as ready and willing to learn from you as they are to teach you. And you'll find that the content is often very different than your other classes. You'll find that you'll read and learn a lot more about other folks of color from our country's history. For me, the biggest thing is that it's student-centered. And so that's kind of the best part. And we get to read Black authors. So the work for our ethnic studies program in future years, I'd say the work is to continue to push so that this program can continue to grow. I think that ethnic studies education is the type of education that every human needs to have in order for our country to look different in future years than it does now and than it has 400 years ago. And so I think one big job is to grow. I think the other job is to help our young students of color in particular to continue to find their voices and continue to be like change agents and leaders in their community first, which means your school first, and then the streets next, and then your home, or any combination thereof. I think the work is to find ways to encourage young people of color specifically to become educators so that future generations of Black and Brown young people have teachers in the classroom who look like them, who sound like them, who understand some of the situations and things that they've been in. And I think the work for our ethnic studies program is to engage more of our white families and more of our white admin and more of our white teachers to understand sort of the privileges that come with being white, and to help us sort of build a stronger community at Holyoke High. So in the halls and in the streets of like Holyoke, which are all really big tasks. But I think like if people stay focused and we all work together on it, and we have that shared vision of what we know ethnic studies can do, anti-racist sort of education, I think we'll be able to get there. So those are like a few big things I'd say. And as far as like freedom dreaming, I think one really cool freedom dream would be to like be able to have ethnic studies be something that's so universal that there's curriculum out there for every teacher. So it's not so hard, it's not so challenging to get this like amazing education to you all. I think there could be ethnic studies schools where the entire framework is built on the young people and is built on freedom and like liberation, where school to prison pipeline like is non-existent. There's no sentiment of it at all. So I think those are my freedom dreams, right? Classrooms that have these sort of things in the background.
I am Christina Villarreal. Everyone calls me V or Dr. V. I am the director of the Teacher Education Program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I also teach the first and only Ethnic Studies in Education course that's been offered at the Harvard Ed School. I've been teaching that class for 5 years now. Started with only about 30 students, and this semester we had 120 graduate students. Future principals, teachers, leaders, policymakers, artists, all taking ethnic studies at Harvard. So that is my role. Prior to that, ethnic studies raised me. And so that's a huge part of my story. I took my first ethnic studies class when I was in high school, back at home in the Bay Area, California. It's where I grew up. And I had a teacher that fought for an ethnic studies class. They're very similar to how your teachers are fighting for ethnic studies for you in your classrooms in Holyoke. And that fight, that struggle is what really binds us in ethnic studies. So that was how I came to learn ethnic studies. I got to major in ethnic studies when I was in college at UC Berkeley. And then I also went to SF State and got my master's in ethnic studies, the original College of Ethnic Studies. So if you've watched Agents of Change, a lot of those folks you see there, Roger Alvarado is one of my mentors, a good and loving family member. I consider him family. And so really the folks at SF State making ethnic studies, really the roots, right? The roots of our continued movement and struggle for ethnic studies here. And so that's where I was trained and how I came to be part of ethnic studies. And I think about all the ways that they kind of raised me and prepared me to continue teaching and learning ethnic studies in the spaces I've been in on the East Coast. I also had a chance, having been here on the East Coast now for, almost 10 years, I've been working closely. Another good friend of mine is Dr. Curtis Acosta. He was the teacher in Tucson, right? Helped to lead that movement there when they did outlaw ethnic studies. And I work very closely with his organization, where we really go all over the country, training and preparing teachers and principals to bring ethnic studies into their schools and districts. And so as you're probably learning in your classes, like ethnic studies, it's more than just a class, right? It's a movement. It's a family, it's a lifetime, it's a way of being in the world. And so my ethnic studies family is what allowed me to have a beautiful chance to connect with and build with teachers in Holyoke who hit me up and like, listen, we're trying to bring ethnic studies and we want to be able to all work together. And that's kind of how it works, right? Is that's the way that friendships and family work. And that's how ethnic studies works. It's always been about and been rooted in our communities, for us and by us. So that was really how I had a chance to then come and build and do some work and some freedom dreaming around what ethnic studies could really look like in classrooms in Holyoke, that are really about, in the same ways that When I was teaching ethnic studies in Oakland, we wanted to understand the histories of Oakland and how they came to impact our lives around us. In the same ways that ethnic studies in Holyoke is about understanding, well, what's happening? What's the history of this community? And how did it create the conditions that we want to be able and that we have the agency to transform now? So that's really the work that I'm excited to continue to do with my friends and my homies back at home in Oakland, and then my new family and homies out here on the East Coast, including the amazing teachers in Holyoke. Why do we need ethnic studies in 2020? The same reason we needed ethnic studies in 1968, the same reason we needed ethnic studies in 1492. I mean, we pick any year from the beginning of this settler colonial project that we call the United States. We needed ethnic studies from jump. But needing it in 2020, I would say, are the same reasons that we've needed it from the moment European colonialism began, again, this project, and it is a colonial project, right? When we really understand the history of it, and part of it, that's also why, to be able to understand and recognize the United States as a very deliberate project of settler colonialism. A lot of our books won't tell us that, right? A lot of the books that are force fed to us from the moment we step into schools. A lot of the schools, we know the history of education in the United States. Now, people who look like me, one, weren't allowed at one point. My people were legally banned from the United States, 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Ethnic studies taught me that. My history classes didn't teach me that, right? And so we need ethnic studies to be able to understand and see histories that reflect who we are and who our ancestors were, and importantly, in our full humanity. Ethnic studies allows us to understand us through the lens of our lived experiences and not through a Eurocentric lens, right? Most of education is filtered through it. So even when we are teaching subject matter about people of color, that's kind of the problem. It becomes about us and not really with us and for us. And ethnic studies, again, from jump was always emerged from and was about our stories, our narratives, how our narratives counter white supremacy, counter power in ways that have really taken our humanity, have assaulted and attacked our humanity as people of color. And also, right, for white students as well to understand, how has white supremacy actually deprived all of us? How has it been violent towards all of us? It's been disproportionately violent towards people of color, but it also has created violence in white communities. And ethnic studies is about countering that, right? Is about helping us to heal from the impact and the violence of white supremacy through a study of our brilliance, our cultural genius, our ways of being and moving through the world, our solutions to some of the most persistent challenges that our communities face. And when we look at the conditions of 2020, they're not new. Remember that. They're not new. What's new is the way people are talking about it. That suddenly people are talking about race and talking about white supremacy more. But these are things that have been part of the fabric of the United States since its founding. And so ethnic studies then becomes what one of my mentors, Dr. Jason Ferreira at SF State, will say that it isn't just the fruit of the struggle, it's a vehicle of the struggle, right? And we need it because it is bigger. It's bigger than a syllabus, right? It's more than a curriculum, right? It's a political commitment, a movement, and a way of life. If we can imagine a world that valued ethnic studies, that would be a world that values all of us. That would be a world that values you. A world that values ethnic studies means schools where you are not being policed. You are not being questioned for the way you wear your hair, the way that you talk, the way that you dress, because ethnic studies would give us a lens, a framework, language to demand to demand the recognition and the celebration of our many ways of showing up and being our full selves. But right now, because we're in a world that questions ethnic studies. And as long as ethnic studies is questioned, then we are being questioned as people of color, as Black, Indigenous people of color, as gender nonconforming. We currently live in a world where if we do not conform to a status quo, if we don't conform to Eurocentric standards of beauty, Eurocentric middle-class standards of carrying ourselves, speaking, dressing, acting, I get questioned all the time for how I show up at Harvard. But I'm showing up as me because ethnic studies taught me to. Ethnic studies demanded and gave me permission to be who I am unapologetically. And so because of that, like I value ethnic studies and I value that then. I value the ways that all my students show up in as their full selves. And so I think a world that values ethnic studies is a world that values us. It's also a world that denounces white supremacy. It's also a world that doesn't say, well, was that racist? Nah, man, if we said it's racist, it's racist. And allow us to name it and allow us to dismantle that. A world that values ethnic studies is a world that's committed to dismantling systems of oppression, power, and privilege. It's a world that actually is committed to our healing and our humanity. So I think when we begin to see and feel those, and we all know what those spaces feel like. We don't maybe get them often, but we know when we feel it, when we feel whole, when we feel seen, when we feel loved, when we feel cared for, that's in Lakesh, right? Tu eres mi otro yo. You are my other me. To me, right, ethnic studies, when it is valued, we are in a world where teachers practice that. They really look into the eyes of their students and really see and recognize, like, if I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. So there's a difference. You might teach ethnic studies, but if you don't value it, you're gonna have in Lakesh on a poster on your wall and still be harming others while also then doing harm to yourself. So to value ethnic studies is to be about it, is to practice it in your everyday life, in your families, in your relationships, in your community, with our postal workers, with the people who are helping to try to keep our spaces safe and COVID-free right now, with our teachers, with our students, with our babies, with our grandparents, right? Curtis Acosta always like reminds us when we do these trainings, we always say, we always have to think about, right? The indigenous philosophy of 7 generations before and 7 generations ahead. A world that values ethnic studies embraces that intergenerational wisdom and recognizes the intergenerational trauma that we are all working to heal from and places that at the forefront of what we are doing in schools. And so, you know, until then, there are spaces that do value it. Let's name that. There are spaces in this world that currently value and love ethnic studies. And so I would say, right, that the crew of teachers, right, in Holyoke value and love ethnic studies, and are working to expand that to become part of a larger collective in partnerships, right, with teachers in New York and in Connecticut and in Providence and in Oakland and in San Francisco and in LA and in Arizona. That becomes, right, like that solidarity piece is also important to valuing and loving ethnic studies in ourselves. Why did I choose ethnic studies and why do I continue this work? You know, I often say ethnic studies chose me. From the moment I was introduced to ethnic studies, I describe it as my teacher, my first ethnic studies teacher in high school really opened the door to the garden of ethnic studies. And I've been in here nurturing and sowing freedom dreams ever since. That's how I describe it. It's like, I've been in this garden of ethnic studies since I was a teenager. And I chose it because, well, I continue to choose it, or what I call always renew my vows to justice, because ethnic studies helped me to fall in love with justice, to fall in love with my own humanity, the humanity of my ancestors, of my students that I've had a chance to work with. Ethnic studies has really given me both the tools, the lens, and I would say the armor. I feel sometimes, because, Harvard can be a really kind of sometimes hostile and violent space. Not always, but often. And ethnic studies protects me, because I feel then, like Dr. Maya Angelou said, right, is I come as one and I stand as 10,000. That's like the wisdom of ethnic studies, is it really draws on that ancestral wisdom and really values it in a way that we carry it into all of our spaces. Because choosing ethnic studies is choosing to commit yourself to a lifetime struggle and a lifetime movement. And so even when I first started teaching ethnic studies at Harvard, I was living in New York. I was taking the bus or the train once a week from New York City to teach ethnic studies at Harvard. I want to be clear. I did that because I've mentioned, right, my story and my West Coast ethnic studies roots. When I was doing that, I wasn't doing that as a commitment to Harvard. It was my commitment to ethnic studies. That's why I did it. That's why I continue to do it. When I came and started teaching at Brown, I would still commute once a week to teach this class, ethnic studies at Harvard, again, because I'm committed to ethnic studies, because of everything ethnic studies has given me, my students, and my family. And so I choose it over and over again because I genuinely believe in the healing power of ethnic studies. When we get to learn our histories and our narratives in a space where we get to share our stories, which are sacred, that's also why, like, choosing it is also tied to like why I continue, because it provides an opportunity for me to fall in love again every single year, to fall in love with justice, to fall in love with my students. Because getting to teach ethnic studies, right? This year I just finished teaching 120 graduate students, mostly students of color, at Harvard. And that space, and this was on Zoom, that space is one of the most sacred and powerful spaces I experienced, and ethnic studies makes that possible, to be able to have a place where we are really centering our counter narratives, where we are fighting to understand. And in that place, we would be angry, we would be sad, we would cry together, we would laugh, we would dance, we would talk about our healing, our joy, our resistance, our trauma. That's the vehicle of struggle, right? That it represents. And when you have those spaces, it really, as one of my TAs says, it's more than lighting a fire, right? I had one teacher light that fire, and ethnic studies just continues to pour gasoline on it, because it fuels me. There's like, it's my favorite class to teach. It's my favorite class in the world to teach, because I get to learn. I always say, like, my syllabus, right? We might all choose the same readings. Maybe you're reading from like a different mirror, or maybe you're reading from, right, Rethinking Ethnic Studies, right? That we might all read these books because you'll say like, oh my gosh, don't you get tired of teaching the same thing? Oh, look at that, represent. And I said, no, I don't get tired of teaching the same material, because it's never the same. Because if it's really an ethnic studies classroom, so much of that is about bringing our stories, our lens, and our interpretation to the syllabus, to the readings, and working through it together and looking at it in relationship. What does it mean to be in relation with and for ethnic studies? And so I think, to build those relationships with the material, with my students, with my own histories, getting to heal alongside my students, that's what fuels me to continue the work. to get to bring that and experience that with teachers all over the country, to also then hear back from my students who took my ethnic studies class in Oakland, like more than 10 years ago, who were in my middle school classroom, who were in my classroom at San Francisco State, because I taught intro to ethnic studies there for 3 years, to then get, and then to see those students connect. Again, like I said, it's a family, it's a movement, and it's a political commitment. And when you're really deeply committed to it, it's a lifelong relationship, and that fuels me to keep going. Oh, what work is currently being done in my institution at Harvard to grow the national ethnic studies movement? So I think that activism and organizing, it can look so different. And I think part of it is us recognizing where do we want to be in the movement. And one of my best friends, she also does a lot of ethnic studies work, Dr. Farima Porkorshi. She teaches at University of San Francisco. The last protest she went to, she had a sign, right, that a teacher's place is in the revolution. And so I think that I see that in terms of my work in teaching ethnic studies there, I see it as, well, one of my favorite quotes as a teacher is from one of my favorite rappers, philosophers, Tupac Shakur. And he said, "I may not change the world, but I guarantee I will spark the mind of the person who will change the world." And that's how I feel getting to teach ethnic studies in a place like Harvard. Sometimes I feel like I'm lighting dynamite. And I've had people, so again, when I've had 30 students, those 30 students go on and become teachers, principals, write policies. They go on to work in Washington, D.C. So in terms of growing it, now this year, ethnic studies became one of the core classes at the ed school. So I taught four different classes of ethnic studies to 120 students. Those 120 students are now going to bring ethnic studies to wherever they were. And these students are all over the world because we were on Zoom this year. So I have students who are now, right, bringing ethnic studies to their school that they run in Costa Rica, or I have a student who is in Japan who's like, I want to bring ethnic studies to how I prepare teachers here in Japan. I have students who are in LA, in Texas. How do we interrogate the Texas curriculum through the lens of ethnic studies? And so again, this isn't the only way to grow a national movement, but I see it as the path, right? That in terms of my own work is through the relationships that you build in a classroom, and through that study, and through that organizing, and through the development and creation of different passion projects that are connected, and through the lens of ethnic studies. So you can even see a lot, the projects that my students created, some of them are writing policies to bring ethnic studies to entire districts. Some of them are working on changing the names, right? Racist names of schools. That's an ethnic studies movement. That's a project. And so because I have so many different kinds of students in my class who are placed in so many places nationally, it really looks different. What binds us in this national, I think, movement is our commitment to ethnic studies, and doing our work through that lens, through that way of being, that really centers and values and celebrates again the lives, the histories, and the genius of people of color, through our own perspectives, and not the ways in which Eurocentric lenses have filtered out our humanity and our stories. And so I think seeing that bloom and spread in so many parts of the country and the world has been amazing. It's like I've been teaching more than 15 years now. So it's like kind of the each one and teach one. That's been really exciting to see ethnic studies grow in that way. And so the fact that there are this many students being trained and having ethnic studies be part of their core experiences in a master's degree of education at Harvard is an exciting I think contribution to the movement of ethnic studies.
My name is Artnelson Concordia, And currently I am the teacher on special assignment, or I like to call myself the program coordinator for Santa Barbara Unified School District's Ethnic Studies program. What is ethnic studies? Ethnic studies it's going to be a long definition, and then I'll talk about what those parts mean. But basically, ethnic studies is a field. It's a discipline that examines, interrogates what we call the social construction of race and racism, the impact of racism, particularly on communities of color. And to me, it really is an answer to a problem. What problem? The problem of racism, particularly the problem of white supremacy. And if we understand, and because we understand that that racism is a problem, we have to look at the root of where that comes from, and as well as the impact of racism upon all of our communities, and not just communities of color, but white folks as well. And so we as a society have to look at that problem, examine where it comes from, look at the impact, and ultimately find a way to challenge and overturn and solve that problem. So lastly, the third part, ethnic studies is a deeply, deeply powerful way for all of us to come to know and love who it is we are, right? Knowledge of self is fundamental to ethnic studies, because from knowledge of self, that's the only way that you can really get mutual recognition of others. And mutual recognition and respect is key for what we call solidarity, where folks who have each other's back, or communities, individuals really stand together for common purpose. And that common purpose, and I think those aspects of building knowledge of self and solidarity really is what gets us to self-determination, the ability, the power to chart a direction for ourselves and our community, and to get there. So that is what ethnic studies is for me. In the year 2020, ethnic studies now more than ever, and it goes back to this long-standing problem of racism that for too long has not been solved. And so long as we are unable to solve that, we have to keep pushing for ethnic studies, because in the end, understanding that race was invented, race is not real, not biologically real, and yet it has such an immense impact. Not race, but racism has such an immensely negative impact on all of us. And so as we head into 2021, we're finding that more and more people are understanding that ethnic studies needs to be a part of developing a critical consciousness amongst all people, but particularly young people. And now, again, more than ever, it is a time where we wield knowledge and wisdom of what can help answer the problem, solve the problem of racism. And the more people that have ethnic studies as foundational knowledge, I think the sooner we can get to solving this problem. I think we'd have a much more loving and kind and respectful and creative and promising world of possibility, of collective thought partnering on solving not just the problem of racism, but the problems of sexism and homophobia and heteronormativity, all of these things, right? And I think what's important about ethnic studies is that though we focus in on social construction of race and the impact of racism, that we're also very mindful of the different parts of who we are, right? The intersections, the different aspects of what makes our lives what they are, whether that's our class background, our sex and gender, sexuality, abilities, all of these aspects of our lives cause us, I think, a great deal of, yes, beauty. It's a wonderful thing to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and yet too many people in society don't see that, right? And that causes harm and oppression and suffering for folks within that community. And so whether you're a woman, whether you're a person of color, whether you're working class, or all of the above, like there's a need to challenge these dominant systems, these oppressive systems. And I think ethnic studies can help move us in that direction. And because we believe in knowledge and love of self, because we believe in solidarity and self-determination, I think ethnic studies can really facilitate an all-rounded liberation, an all-rounded development, and ultimately positive evolution of society. That I know that's asking a lot, but I really believe, and I've witnessed incredible transformation of specifically of young people, and specifically of myself as a not so young person, as well as teachers who engage in ethnic studies. To me, like witnessing that applied to larger society, I think we can do a great deal of positive stuff. Why I chose ethnic studies, really, honestly, I didn't choose ethnic studies. Ethnic studies found me, chose me. I was a social studies teacher, and I think generally I'm in education because I see it as a lane I can really make impact and positive change in. Because I come from the world of community organizing, and before I was in the classroom, I was out in the community, really helping folks identify campaigns to address problems. And a lot of times, like we would lose campaign after campaign. And a lot of times I'd be engaging in work that I felt was about making the world a better place, but I couldn't see it, right? I didn't see any tangible evidence of that. I mean, in hindsight, I know organizers, as much as educators, maybe even more so, are key in changing the world. But I got burnt out. And so I went into education so I could see the impact of my effort to make the world a better place. And I was kind of like, okay, cool, here and there, making, I think, some progress. But when at one point I was asked to be an ethnic studies teacher, and I agreed, kind of even hesitatingly. And it wasn't until maybe a year or two into it where I realized, oh, dang, like this is a place where all that I wanted to see in the community organizing work I was doing actually happened, like in front of my eyes, to see my colleagues, to see my students, to see my school, to see my community, like really visibly changed and impacted positively by ethnic studies.
My name is Ron Espiritu. I've been an educator for the past 15 years in Los Angeles, California. In those 15 years, I've always taught high school ethnic studies. I'm one of the founding members of the People's Education Movement, and I'm also a past national board member of the Education for Liberation Network. Currently, I'm the coordinator of the Ethnic Studies for All program at Camino Nuevo charter schools in the downtown MacArthur Park, Westlake, Echo Park neighborhoods of Los Angeles. And in that program, we have been developing over the past 6 years a kindergarten through 12th grade interdisciplinary ethnic studies program. For me, ethnic studies is, it's a way of life, first of all. It's a way of being and interacting. It's a way of educating ourselves and educating others. It's a way of engaging and being in community. Ethnic studies has a 50+ year history in the United States of America, beginning in San Francisco State University and expanding to colleges and universities across the country. It's an academic discipline that is an umbrella to many other different disciplines, including African American studies, Black studies, Chicana studies, Latinx, Latino studies, women's studies, queer studies, Indigenous, Native American studies, and Asian American studies, Filipino American studies, and so much more. And to me, ethnic studies has really been it's opened the gates to academia, to scholarship, to research, to help students to use their education as a way to solve problems in our community. It's an offshoot of the civil rights movement, the Black liberation struggles, the Third World Liberation Front, right? Like, how do we have an intersectional approach to using the institutions that we attend, including K-12 and college and universities, to gain the knowledge and the experience, the know-how, the research skills, to be able to look deeply into our communities on a local level and also state and national level to solve the major problems that exist, both in the past and currently. And so ethnic studies is an evolving field. It's an inclusive field, and it's a way to learn about ourselves and practice that knowledge of self. And it's also a way to learn about each other and to learn about diverse people's experiences and knowledge and histories and struggle. And how can we unite to work together to use our scholarship, to use our activism, to use our skill sets, our innovation, our creativity to create a completely different world. In a world like the Zapatistas say from Mexico, from Chiapas, Mexico, a world where many worlds exist at the same time, a world where resistance is possible, in a world where as we're creating that, right, as we're creating that new world, we're living in a different world together. And so, conceptually, that's what I see as ethnic studies. We absolutely need ethnic studies in the year 2020. The summer uprisings, the summer Black Lives Matter uprising protest movement, largest gatherings and protests in US history, tells us how important it is for young people and old people and intergenerations of folks to understand how systemic and institutional oppression impacts Black, Indigenous, people of color in unique and profound ways, to understand how these colonial systems impact women, LGBTQ folks, how it impacts all different identities of people. Again, how we can organize together to fight back against a system that doesn't take care of us, doesn't protect us, and that uses police violence, state-sanctioned murder against us, right? The summer uprisings teach us that it's necessary and it's profound, and it's the work that inside of our schools to begin to dismantle and abolish the oppressive systems that exist in society. And so ethnic studies is the opportunity for us to engage in that struggle academically, but also to engage in that struggle in the community. And when we think about the needs for, in Los Angeles, right, the movements are all on top of each other, right? Movements for lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, trans folks, the feminist movement in LA, environmental justice movements that are led by youth, that are led by frontline communities of color, that are led by Indigenous people. When we think about the movement for Black lives and the intersectional approach that exists in our local communities and on a national level, we have to use our education, our classes and our educational opportunities in order to understand how these systems impact us and our families and our histories, and take ownership of it and use it as a place to create community, as a place to create, as Dr. Bettina Loves says, to create home place amongst and with each other, and to also use our knowledge and our skill sets to create a more just world. When I think about the experiences of this year, 2020, when I think about how the history books will be written, I think about how important ethnic studies is. Like, we have to write the books about 2020. We have to do the research about what happened this year. And what happened this year is that, number one, right, there's a global pandemic that is disproportionately impacting Black, Indigenous, people of color, that is disproportionately impacting people that do not have the same privileges, that do not have the same rights, that are poor and impoverished. It's disproportionately impacting our communities and our families. And it's so important for us to understand the different systems of oppression that have existed historically and that continue to exist today, so that when we write the story of this year, we're able to include that and incorporate that. And we're also able to tell the story that in the face of state-sanctioned violence and police murder against Black people, against brown people, against indigenous people, both in this country and globally, that amidst that is the largest protest movement in United States history, where millions of people are marching across the country, where millions of people are creating authentic community digitally, where millions of people are creating authentic community in person in order to create a resistance to this system, where educators like Dr. Bettina Love is telling us that we cannot just survive, but we need to thrive through these challenges. And we do that by envisioning and dreaming of a different world and a different possibilities. Dr. Bettina Love says that we need to abolish the current system of education and create something completely different and completely new. I believe that ethnic studies is that vision for what's possible and what's new, but it's going to take an incredible amount of work. And we are basing and building our work off of a 50-year legacy that already exists. We stand on the shoulders of people that come before us. I've even heard from members of the Last Poets. They say that we actually stand on the palms of people because they're lifting us up. So how are we as educators helping to lift students up? And then how are students then educating themselves and or engaging in work in their community, whether it's building a garden or whether it's engaging in grassroots community activism about how to change the funding of a city government, or how to change your schooling system, or how to create more equity in whatever a place that you are working or living in or going to school in. This is all a parts of what would the world look like differently if the values of ethnic studies actually held up. How do we create inclusive communities that welcome people of all races, of all ethnicities, of all gender identities, of all sexual orientations, of all the different complex identities that make up our people, our communities, and our families? That's what I believe ethnic studies needs and is, and that's why we need it in the year 2020. We have experienced in the last 4 years an openly racist, white supremacist president, and the government has worked against us, against the people, against youth. And so ethnic studies allows us to learn about that, understand about that, and work to create alternatives and work to exist in resistance. And so while we're creating that new world and how we're learning in ethnic studies, we're also treating each other differently, and we're creating that new world that we envision for the future. We're actually living that in the present moment. There are a lot of ways to change the world. And the reality is that we need people. We need young people. We need adults. We need students of color. We need students of diverse gender identities and sexual orientations. We need everybody on deck in order to create a new world and a new possibility. Being an educator is one of those ways. And I've seen my role as an educator over the past 15 years as working to plant seeds of critical consciousness, of working to plant seeds of transformation and possibilities of for the future, and also about critical hope. A lot of people, a lot of my friends say that we as ethnic studies educators are hope dealers, and we're dealing in hope. And this isn't false hope. This isn't saying that we have to be positive all the time, but this is saying that through history, if we study it closely, we can see when our ancestors and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and our great-great-grandparents, from all of our diverse perspectives and all of our diverse identities and histories, have survived. They have survived. They have found ways to thrive and to build their families and to build their chosen families and to build community with different people amidst all of the challenges and all of the oppression. Ethnic studies helps us to uncover those stories, to uncover those hidden histories. And I think what it helps us to do is it helps us to find our own selves on that important historical timeline, that doesn't get taught in school in the traditional Eurocentric way. But when we can start to subvert that master narrative or that Eurocentric story, it can be something that can be very inspiring for young people and for adults in co-creating knowledge together, in co-creating different stories about our communities, and in co-creating a different world and a different possibility. So I've chosen to engage in that educational journey because of how hopeful it is, and because of it allows us to engage as educators in a process where we never stop learning. We're constantly learning with our students and with their families. And in turn, the families and the students are learning with us. And the theoretical lenses and the historical foundation of ethnic studies allows us to put on different lenses to view the world in different ways, to arrive to a more just, a more equitable, a more liberated world where we can all live together, distance, and to envision and to live in different possibilities.
Hi, I'm Iohann Vega, Director of Media Engagement with Holyoke Media, and I've been connected with ethnic studies for the past 5 years, and as a community partner and helping with media literacy and working a lot with identity through media, storytelling, and creative work with the students. So this has been a really beautiful and creative way to collaborate and helping ethnic studies to grow and to be present. Ethnic studies, after experiencing it and seeing the experience through the students, I would like to say ethnic studies is the missing part of the history and the background that every person should know about the place they live and the place they come from. Ethnic studies is really important to Holyoke, and it should be equally important for every community because that connects to know and understand the situation of not only the country, the state, but also the very local area that may have connection to backgrounds that go back to indigenous people, that through history have different presence and representations of different cultures and backgrounds that may or may not be present today. And it is important to acknowledge and understand those identities in order to see why things are the way they are today. Particularly when we talk about a city like Holyoke that has had such a rich history of immigration and cultural blending, being today in a place that only sees majority of two cultures and one of them has full control of the narrative is problematic because it should be a balance narrative of the majority of cultures being represented in the city plus all the rest that are here, but they are not being so much visible or represented or even acknowledged. And this is really important for our students to know about. 2020 is a year that has changed our lives entirely. And do we need ethnic studies, particularly in these times, because it is almost unbelievable to see how much we have evolved and advanced and accomplished many milestones in science, technology, knowledge, but at the same time, as a society, we are going backwards. Or better said, a generation is trying to keep things stuck in their time and in their understanding of things, right or wrong, but just because of their comfort and their lack of willing to learn and get up to date. And you can see that when we refer to oppression, to systemic racism, to inequities in our society that have been a struggle for decades, even centuries. And 2020 was the point of discussion of all of these issues, almost like if we were back on those years. And with that, the situations that are pertinent to our current times. A perfect opportunity for education, a perfect opportunity to relearn, and possibly for this new generation to figure out the way to do things right and be better than the ones who put us in this position today. A world that is more aware of ethnic studies will be more understanding. I think it will be more capable of a dialogue, more capable of reasoning and seeing. There is this say that there's always two sides of a story. I don't agree with that. I think a story has many different angles, as many angles as a circle can have, because you cannot just see things polarized, black or white, or left or right, or right or wrong, or cold and hot. This is the mindset of an old generation that just want to see things that way. So starting by that, we need to see things in all different possible angles. And that's how I think ethnic studies helps people to see the world, their own perception, their own identity from those different perspectives. And once people understand that, many things change. And I think many conversations then can happen, and then we can move forward. Did I got to learn about my own culture during my time at school? I will say yes, I did, but not enough. And then as I grew up, I found out it was just one side of the story, the official one. I'm proud of and glad that I got a really good education, and especially during the first years, I'm a product of the public schools as well. And I have to say that I had a good basic education, and I got a lot to learn and find out. And at the end, I think all the teachers that I had during school, they did an amazing work giving me all the knowledge that I needed to have. Of course, the system is the one who told them how much can they taught me at that time. If it is not because of that critical thinking and that realization that you need to know more about who you are, where are you, and where you come from, I wouldn't be able to know more about everything related to my culture and my identity. And that helped me a lot to continue learning on my own. And I think that's what ethnic studies does. Gives students the realization of a lot of knowledge there is still for them to acquire and for them to look for it, to pursue it, to make it part of their background and their knowledge, their basic knowledge, not to be satisfied with what you are being told by one person or by one book, even by one institution. And that's what I think is the most valuable thing ethnic studies is offering, that opportunity for students to continue learning, to be eager to know more about themselves, and be proud of what they learned throughout the way, and at the same time to question why I didn't knew about this before, why this information was kept held from me. What do I need to do to change that? And it's amazing to see the students taking those actions and making those questions.
Ethnic studies is radical.
Cariño.
Liberating.
Very important.
Truth.
Justice.
Transformative.
Critical thinking.
Another world is possible.
Possibilities.
Identidad.
Necesario.